beautiful people. This is Alex Fransman at Southwood Landscape and Garden Center, and I'm here today to talk to you about orchids. There are plenty different orchid varieties, and right now we have those in stock, like lady slippers, Phalaenopsis mini orchids, oncidiums, reed orchids, dendrobiums, and we have some other varieties too. You should come check it out. I'm going to talk to you today about repotting and getting your orchid to rebloom. So let's talk about reblooming. Some of the key factors in getting your orchid to rebloom is going to be light. If you want your orchids to put on buds, you need some bright and direct light, about half a day. It can take some direct sun in the east window, so morning sunlight. Temperature is also key. Orchids do like it to be about 65 to 90 degrees, a little bit more on the higher end during the day, and sometimes even about 55 in the evenings. The cool temperatures can kind of stimulate the orchids to want to bloom. Also, fertilizing. If your orchid is not flowering currently, then you should be fertilizing your orchid at least once a month, maybe even every other week from March to October. Another key factor in getting orchids to rebloom is the potting. So let's go over and talk about repotting your orchids. When purchasing an orchid or receiving an orchid, you might have a plastic container like this. It's important when the orchid's finished reblooming, or if you're trying to get the orchid rebloom again, you might need to repot your orchid and get it out of this plastic container and get it in an orchid pot. So an orchid pot has holes in the side so it can breathe. It's important to use the right mixture in the pot. So we are going to use an orchid mix that consists of bark, perlite, peat moss chunks, and charcoal, along with sphagnum moss that comes from bogs. When starting out to repot my orchid, I like to break off a little piece of a coffee filter and put it over the hole of my pot. This allows none of the soil to go down into the saucer, but still allows good drainage. You'll start by pulling your orchid out of the plastic pot. Squeeze the sides if needed to get it out. And pull off all that bark. This is important because bark breaks down, so you might not have to go to a bigger size pot year after year, but if you can refresh some of that bark, it's gonna help because bark decomposes, and that could be a reason your orchid isn't blooming. After I've pulled away all this bark, if you have a little plug in here, peat moss, plastic container, I have just a peat moss plug. I'm just gonna kind of pull that away. You might have a plastic container that you need to get some scissors and clip away and just kind of break that little plastic pot out of there so it doesn't restrict your roots. And I'm going to take sphagnum moss, like I showed you here, and I'm going to pre-soak it. You don't have to pre-soak it long, but you'll want to put the moss in a container and put some moisture inside and just kind of work it around until it's moistened. I'll pull up my moss and kind of squeeze out the excess water, and then I'm going to line the orchid pot. So putting that moss all around the sides, I start by just doing the bottom half, and then I'm going to take the orchid mix. I'm going to just put a couple inches in the bottom of the pot over that coffee filter, getting over or under water because of so much surface area. So try to keep it relatively tight when repotting your orchids. Give it a little room, but not too much. Next, I'm going to take moss and kind of work the top half of the sides, lining that pot. And I like to use the stake from the orchid, or you can just use a stick from outside, honestly. And I just kind of like to kind of tap around, maybe get a little bit of that moss down in there, maybe add a little bit. So we started with a little bark, now there's a little moss in between, and then I'm going to put some of that orchid mix, and I'm just gonna kind of tap it down. I love using a stick or a skewer or an orchid stick or whatever you want to do, just to kind of help me tap. That way I'm not pushing down with my hands and breaking anything, which some people could be frightened by. I know I was. And then I'll finish by topping off with sphagnum moss. So just remember, start out with orchid mix on bottom, layer until you have sphagnum moss on top. Sphagnum moss on top is going to help with humidity. Orchids love humidity. Depending on the orchid, it could be between 40 to 80%. So that's all I have for now on orchid repotting and reblooming. If you have any questions or need help, come on by, come into the store. We have a wide selection of orchid products and some beautiful exotic orchids. We do repotting here. We do wrapping. If you want me to repot your orchid, just bring your orchid on